Welcome to this training of Making the Dragon. This training is being sponsored by the Trauma-Informed Primary Prevention Program, and they are the ones responsible for you being able to have access to this training this morning. What we're going to be looking at today is understanding where emotional and behavioral dragons come from. And I'm using the term dragon as a metaphor for behaviors that are sometimes considered bad behavior, sometimes they're considered mental health issues, but what they are is predictable, biologically correct responses. I'm Dr. Bob Rhoton with the Arizona Trauma Institute. If you like the materials you're being exposed to today and would like to read more, these are three of our more recent books that you can certainly connect with on Amazon. So what makes dragons? We all can, how can we understand them? How can we be able to deal with them and recognize that we all have our dragons? The question is not really how they were made, but how can we calm them down? So where I always start with this is the physiology of trauma, because the physiology of trauma is really how a dragon is made. This is a very brief introduction to what trauma, toxic stress, and adversity do in the brain and nervous system. This is a 3-hour training. Just the anatomy and physiology related to trauma is a much longer course all by itself. If you're fascinated by the physiology of this stuff, then you may want to do some more training. Certainly, there are some college classes, most of them are at graduate level, that kind of go through some of this, and otherwise you would have to do kind of some personal reading or some, maybe a whole lot of watching YouTubes of people that are in the world of trauma research. So what we're going to focus on today is just a real brief introduction. We're going to examine the impact of how trauma, toxic stress, and adversity impact the body and nervous system, and how that impacted body and nervous system are responsible for behavior, thinking, and emotions. The nice thing about understanding this is it shifts the view of how we see people. A lot of times what happens is we're seeing the behavior and thinking and emotions that are congruent with trauma, toxic stress, and adversity, and we're thinking of that as being either mental health or behavior problems. And really, the truth is that they are absolutely predictable. And what we often fail to do in society is to help people know how to help reduce the impact of trauma, toxic stress, and adversity on the body and nervous system. That is usually the starting point for any kind of change process. So we're going to start with defining trauma. We're going to then look at how these changes work in the body. We're going to look at how this affects the behavior that you see in children, and let us begin. Trauma, as people think about it, particularly in Western society, is generally thought to be a big bad event. But the reality is that most people that have a pretty good life and then have this bad event without therapy will do pretty well at getting back to the levels that they had before that trauma. Certainly with a little therapeutic support and a good support system and loved ones, they will almost always make that transition pretty successfully. The folks that tend to struggle the most with trauma are not the single event folks. They're the folks that have either chronic traumatic experiences or really early life and continuous experiences that are relatively negative. Trauma is not just an emotional and memory thing. It is actually a nervous system and body thing. And some of the changes that are generated, particularly early in life related to trauma, become lifelong, biologically altered presentations in the body. In other words, those changes that occur early in the life of a person that change their nervous system or the way their brain works actually impacts the rest of their life. This is a really uncomfortable concept for a lot of people, because what we have traditionally believed in our society is that children are so resilient, and what they experience is no big deal. No matter how bad of a parent somebody is or what they've experienced, they'll get through it and be okay. And that is not true. That is a lie. At worst, it is deceptive, because what's happening when children experience adversity is that they have a body that's developing, and it affects the way the brain and nervous system is built, and it continues to affect them throughout their life. So being cavalier with the environment that a child is being raised in is an incredibly irresponsible social, familial, community process. It isn't, we know from the original ACE studies that were done, which we'll talk a little bit about later, is that the half of what created the most severe dysfunction, the most severe behavioral and emotional problems, the most severe health challenges, were not abuse, but dysfunction in families. And that side usually gets overlooked. Everybody realizes that with sexual and physical abuse and emotional and physical neglect, those are certainly abusive. But what everybody tends to ignore is having parents that are not regulated, having an unstable environment, having a chaotic environment, is equally damaging to the child. And so what ends up happening is we think of they're only hurt if somebody abused them. And that is also a protective untruth that adults tell themselves, so they don't have to be responsible for the environment of the child. However, children develop and learn to be able to regulate their body, to be able to regulate their emotions, from how well their adult caregivers accomplish that on a consistent basis. And if the caregivers are not doing that very well, then the likelihood of a child being able to do it well is incredibly poor. The human body is designed to be environmentally reactive and adaptive. In other words, we have a biological mechanism that is constantly studying the environment, and we react to what's going on in the environment. What does that mean? In the developmental period of a child's life, that environment needs to be as stable as possible. It needs to be as warm and nurturing as possible. It needs to be populated by well-regulated, intentional adults that manage their own arousal and overwhelm and have a lot of strategies to do that the child can learn from watching and modeling. And what we have done in this country is increasingly put pressure on the relationship and environment of children. We introduce a lot of social media, a lot of entertainment to distract them so that they don't have to tag along with the parent. The parent could turn the TV on and set them down and walk off and go do stuff. And while that's a great relief to the parent, It is really not demonstrating how the parent can manage themselves so that the child can learn how to do that. What the child is learning is that, that this is what they should focus on, and it is really a dehumanizing process. Trauma, as stated by Dr. Robert Mesa, is an overwhelming demand placed upon the body, the physiology of the system. And symptoms emerge, and they are more severe symptoms the longer this demand is placed upon the body, and the body doesn't have a chance to regulate itself from those demands. When people don't have lengthy opportunities to be in environments characterized as calm and well-regulated, nurturing, relationally safe, with safe and encouraging, predictable, emotional reactions and stability, then they are likely to have psychological, physiological reactions that lead to trauma. In other words, particularly with children, if they are not in a stable, nurturing, safe environment with well-regulating adults that manage themselves, manage their own emotions, and deal with adversity through acts of resilience, then the child is left without a foundation for self-regulation. And when they hit the school systems, they've had at least 5 years to develop habits that don't lend themselves to being functional in an educational setting. The overwhelming message of where particularly the trauma symptoms emerge for children can be laid at the feet of the home environment. They can be laid at the feet of that the community around this child is not populated by well-regulated adults that are nurturing and kind and relationally focused. Many of the adults in their lives have so many of their own unmet needs that they really don't have the emotional depth, wherewithal, or interest to really be having children in their home. And this is really an increasing problem. If you don't believe it's increasing, look at back when I was a kid, there was no child protective services. And now, 55 years later, 60 years later, we not only have child protective services, but we have an incredibly high number of kids involved in those. What that really manifests to us is a massive failure in parenting, a massive failure of adults being able to manage themselves, and a society that doesn't really encourage self-management of adults. So I have introduced the idea that this is all biological processing. So there are a number of hormones and neurochemicals that have an impact on us. And what I'm doing is picking the most familiar for most people as our starting point. So the 4 that I'm starting with are dopamine, oxytocin, serotonin, and endorphin. These are essential to have in balance in our system in order to have an optimal experience and to live optimal health-wise. So most of you are familiar with what dopamine does, but just as a quick review, you can see it here on the screen, that what you're looking at is it helps improve motivation, it increases learning on relevant material. It doesn't help the learning of non-relevant material. It has tied to pleasure. It helps to create patterns. And then we move into oxytocin, which you don't have any drive to attach to somebody if you don't have normal levels of oxytocin. Serotonin is part of the, really related a lot to gut health, but the serotonin has an impact on how we feel about ourselves, our value of ourselves. It also helps us kind of feel positive when we're having interaction with other people. It allows us to experience pleasure. You can have a high level of dopamine and still not be having a lot of pleasure. You can have some, but it's usually related to some action taken. Serotonin also helps with that process. And then endorphins are really the indigenous opioid of the body. It helps it helps with pain management, it helps with inflammation, and it helps calm things like anxiety. And people with good levels of endorphins often don't have compulsive behaviors because they're not looking to, they're not engaging in behavior to get that release from anxiety. So these are 4 basic patterns. As long as they're in what for you is your baseline or normal distribution, then you should have relatively positive emotional, psychological, spiritual balance. You should have more of an optimal life experience. But when these drop, there are serious consequences of that. So let's look at what happens as a drop in dopamine happens. So these are the behaviors you should see. Oops, I'm going back. With a reduction in dopamine, procrastination is biologically correct. Now, what's frustrating about that is people, usually in authority over somebody, get really irritated because they see a person procrastinating. Particularly, I see, teachers with children get really irritated that the kid tends to procrastinate. If their dopamine levels are low, they will procrastinate. Why? Because it's biologically appropriate to do so. It is not bad behavior. It's biologically driven behavior. They're going to struggle with self-esteem. They're going to lack motivation. They're going to feel low energy. They're going to have difficulty focusing. They're going to have difficulty managing anxiety. They're going to have some mood swings. They're going to have some rapid alteration of mood, all related to reduced dopamine. What we often do in the world, and this is, I'm going to say this a couple of different ways, but what I see the most common problem is that you have adults, particularly in the education system, that aren't regulating themselves very well. They have dysregulated children come into their rooms or on their campuses, and what they see that is actually biologically correct responses that tell you that something needs to change in that kid's environment, they see these things as willful, intentional behavior, that this is something someone is choosing to do. And that is wrong. That's an immoral thought, that they are choosing to procrastinate because they're willful. Most often, it's always going to be related to a dopamine deficit. But the dysregulated adult who can't manage themselves well is going to see the reduced dopamine, is going to see the procrastination, going to see the inability to focus, going to see the anxious feelings as intentional behavior, and the unregulated adult's going to react negatively to that and try to punish, shame, or in some other way be aggressive with the person that's already dysregulated. And now you have a dysregulated adult who's the only person that could possibly create regulation in that environment, actually triggering more dysregulation in a classroom of folks, particularly if they have a history of being out of balance because of the things that have happened to them. Next, you have the reduced oxytocin. This means people are going to feel alone even though they're in a room full of folks. They're going to feel different. They're going to feel alienated from everybody else. They're going to be stressed. They're going to lack motivation. They're going to feel disconnected. Here's a whole room full of people they know, and they don't really feel like they're like any of them. And they can't really understand what those other folks are experiencing. This leaves them often feeling anxious. And there's a lot of insomnia related to this. So again, this is not willful behavior. This is not mental illness. Let me say that again. This is not willful, chosen, intentional behavior. This is biological responses. The question needs to be what's going on in that person's body. What is going on that their system is affecting the level of oxytocin? When you look at reduced serotonin, low self-esteem, very emotionally reactive, a lot of almost instant rages, instant crying attacks, panic and anxiety attacks, feeling hopeless, obsessive behaviors, compulsive behaviors, and again, a lot of influence in insomnia. Those are not willful behaviors. They're not mental illness. They are the result of having reduced serotonin. Reduced endorphins also has a cost. You're going to have more depression. You're going to have more pain and aches. You're going to have inflammation-related disorders at a lot higher ratio than the general public. Mood swings, and also insomnia. So when these things are in balance, we have a pretty good chance of living optimally, having better health, having better mental health, and being more effective and actually growing and improving. When these levels reduce, the behaviors that you see are biologically appropriate. We've got to stop thinking of them as mental illness and instead ask ourselves what's going on in the body of this person. And what that means is we need everyone to have a better understanding of the body that they're walking around in and how bodies work. So does this make sense to you? Emotion, thinking, and behavior are driven by changes in biochemistry within the brain and nervous system. Now, if that tugs at a well-held belief system, I want you to ask yourself what the benefit of your belief system is. When I've had this conversation in trainings where I actually have a live audience, it's been really interesting. And what usually comes out of it is that adults enjoy seeing those behaviors in children as a problem, or in other adults as a problem that represents either their intention, the person that's having those represents their intentional choices or their mental illness. And as long as it's bad choices and mental illness, then there's nothing that's required of me as a person to do that. But when you shift it to saying what's going on in the environment that's keeping this biochemistry off balance, because the biochemistry is in direct response to environment, you got to ask yourself what's going on in the environment. What do we need to change in the environment? What do we need to do to redesign the way schools operate and the way classrooms are designed? What do we need to do in all situations where we have children involved to really make the environment one that is supportive to children? And that runs right up against the systems. So a lot of times what we see is people have very kind of strong ideas about that's just bad behavior and they need to be punished for that, or they need to be told differently. And the reality is that the environment is actually provoking a good amount of this. And the question really is, as the adult in the environment, what do I need to do to change the environment, to improve the environment, to make the environment a safer environment, a more engaging environment, a more relational environment? The responsibility for child regulation is not the child. It is the adults in the child's life. Children learn to regulate themselves through acts of co-regulation with a regulated adult. So if you have a classroom full of kids with trauma histories, and you have a person that has as the leader in that room, or the adult in that environment, not being incredibly well regulated themselves, they're going to set each other off. And the learning that's going to occur is going to be low. The behavior management is going to be problematic. And of course, the defense of the adult is always to blame the child. Well, that's just a really difficult child, or I've got several really difficult children. What that really is, that's a defensive structure saying, I don't want to be responsible for me and creating this environment. It's their fault that this is happening. They're the one engaging in bad behavior. It protects the collective ego of the education system, and that is problematic for children that have trauma histories. So there are completely predictable, absolutely correct biological responses when there's also an increase in certain chemicals. So I'm going to start with the three that are probably the most well-known. Cortisol is probably the best well-known of that group, and I'll cover it last. But let's be really honest. These are behaviors that you should see because they are correct. They're biologically predictable when changes in these hormones occur. So let's look at noradrenaline first. If you have a increase in increase in noradrenaline, you will feel an increase in anger and agitation. You will be more aggressive. You will be increasingly assertive. You will be controlling. You will have some hostile tendencies, a little bit of hostility. It's not going to help you learn emotionally, because the emotion that's being provoked is irritation and anger, and it doesn't help, and it actually interferes with us using emotional intelligence to learn from the situation, which means we're going to have a reduced amount of empathy. Now, let's look at adrenaline. When you get an increase in adrenaline, you're going to see increased fear, anxiety. You're going to have people wanting to shut down, run away, turn off, disconnect. They're going to want to withdraw. They're not going to be able to focus much on anything, because focus requires you being in a balanced nervous system. They're going to be hyperactive or fidgety. And now let's go to cortisol. One of the primary problems with increases of cortisol is that it affects the four basic hormones that we need to be in balance. It directly impacts dopamine, oxytocin, serotonin, and endorphins, and it reduces them in your system. What else does cortisol do for you? Remember, these are biologically correct responses. These are not bad behavior. They are not mental illness. You're gonna have a reduced ability to do reality checking the higher your cortisol levels go. You're going to have reduced executive functioning. You're going to be more survival oriented than intentional. You're going to have a reduced ability to inhibit yourself. That part of the brain that has, if you want to think of it as your on and off switch, the don't do that, go ahead and do that switch. The don't do that switch gets suppressed or turned off as cortisol increases. And so what we're often doing is engaging in behaviors with people that trigger the release of cortisol, and then we're surprised that they can't function the way we would like them to function. It's kind of a general lack of awareness. Reduced logic and reasoning. And they're going to have difficulty forming sequential memories. So these are biologically correct responses. Again, they're not mental illness. They are definitely not bad behavior. Now, can they be difficult to deal with? Yes, they can be difficult to deal with, particularly if the adult trying to deal with them is not well regulated themselves. If the adult in the environment is not fully in charge of their own emotional life, they have no business working with children. Now, a lot of people say, well, that's kind of offensive. I don't mean it to be offensive. It's just the truth. If you are an adult and you are not if you're not in a well-regulated state, if you are not in charge of your emotional reactions, if you are not aware of your physiology and able to keep yourself calm in the most stressful situations, you really should not be in an environment where you're responsible for children. Because you don't have the wherewithal to create the environment to help them calm down. Only a person that has that self-possession has the wherewithal to create the environment necessary to help the child calm down in relationship to the adult. So I'm not going to belabor that anymore. What happens when the body goes into this limbic shift? In other words, when it shifts from being in a balanced nervous system into an arousal system, the hypothalamus activates, the adrenal glands release adrenaline and cortisol. These are stress hormones that affect not only the respiratory system, but also the cardiovascular system. It produces extra blood sugar or glucose to boost your energy. All your muscles tighten up. Most of you experience this. Somebody walks around a corner and startles you. Your whole body moves into this shifted state of being, and you're now in a kind of a hyper-aware looking for the danger. Now, usually passes pretty quickly, but that's that same process. Now, that process is not a good or bad process. It's just a process. It's part of the survival system that we have as human beings. Without that survival system in place, we would often die young. We wouldn't learn so well from experiences, and it would be problematic. To reach adulthood and not being able to manage this, though, is problematic. And when I say adulthood, I'm not talking about 18. I'm talking about by the time you're in your, mid, late 20s, early 30s, you need to be able to manage this in your own body to really be able to help the environment manage better. So every human being goes through what we call an adversity cycle or an adaptation cycle or a trauma cycle. I don't really care what label you use, but we move from being in a regulated state into a dysregulated state, and then through some time and attention back into a re-regulated state. So let me give you an easy one. Well-regulated babies asleep, peaceful. They begin to wake up. They feel dirty diaper. They feel hungry. And when they realize that they're having this experience, they get dysregulated and begin to fuss. What happens? The regulated adult interacts with them, changing them, feeding them, nurturing them, and they become re-regulated. That is the natural cycle that we all move through. And to find a metaphor to use with this, what I've kind of labeled it is, when we're in a regulated state, we're in Bruce Banner mode. When we move into the dysregulated state, we're moving into Hulk mode or Hulk brain. And as we re-regulate, we move back into Bruce Banner brain. The problem with trauma is that it tends to lock people in the dysregulated state. And the longer they are in that dysregulated state, the more symptoms emerge, the more problematic behaviors emerge, the more problematic emotions emerge. This is really a failure of the environment. It has less to do with the character of the person, which is, really listen to this, it has less to do with the character of the person and more to do with what's going on in the environment. Wow, that's such a hard concept for folks to get a handle on. I struggle with teachers and parents and, even in other systems that deal with children to get this idea across. If you want a child to be regulated, you cannot do that through commanding, punishment, aggressive means. What you can do is get them to shut down. If you want them to be well regulated, the adults in their life must be in Bruce Banner mode and must be able to help create an environment where that is the appropriate state to be. So a lot of times folks say, well, you're just blaming, teachers, you're blaming parents, you're blaming the adults. I'm not blaming anybody. I'm citing, this is what the science would indicate, that we as human beings, from a neuroscience and biological perspective, are dependent on our environment, that we react in response to our environment. We build neural patterns based on ourselves reacting to the environment. Well, who has control of the environment? The adults in a child's world. So a dysregulated adult cannot create a regulated child. A dysregulated teacher can't create a room of regulated students. I hope that makes sense to people. So another simple way of looking at trauma comes in different categories. Rather than just thinking of trauma as a single event, let me give you some different languaging for it. An acute trauma is a single event. Chronic trauma is repetitive, maybe nothing really terrible, but it just happens frequently on a repeated basis. That's chronic. And then complex is when the environment is overly stressful on an almost continual basis. Often complex trauma started that stressful body overwhelm even prenatally. So, we're dealing with kind of the way to think of these things. Most of the kids that end up in the foster care system are dealing with complex trauma, or at least chronic trauma. They're not dealing with the impact of an acute trauma. The reality of what's available clinically is that most of the people trained as trauma therapists are trained to deal with acute trauma, not complex trauma, and particularly complex trauma in children. So you're going to have to do your homework if you're going to make a referral to somebody, because the average therapist is going to lack the skills needed to work with the complex trauma of children. Trauma often comes out of protective responses, and individuals' normal coping responses are supposed to provide a sense of control, connection, meaning, and safety. However, the more complex the trauma is, or more complex the trauma learning history is, the more you're going to see behaviors and belief systems that are built, and they're looking to guarantee safety, to guarantee clarity, to guarantee certainty, and to guarantee predictability. When we talk about classroom management from a trauma-informed lens with school personnel, we often talk about what are you doing within the classroom to create safety. And when we talk about safety, we're not talking primarily of physical safety. While that's included, it's not the primary. Physical safety, emotional safety, psychological safety, social safety, and spiritual safety. What are you doing to create those in the environment where the child is? How are you making it really clear? Clarity. In other words, there's no surprises. Everything is just very well explained. There's really good imaging on, this is what it's going to look like. If you do this, this is the predictable outcome. That is, do these things, you'll have this outcome. That's kind of laying out the certainty. And all of this goes to helping them have a greater level of predictability. If you are sitting there thinking about, well, that's a lot of work, it is. And a dysregulated adult can't do it. Again, this is one of the reasons that I'm suggesting. If you cannot manage yourself well, if you cannot manage your own emotions and your own arousal and be attuned to what's going on in your own body, you probably shouldn't be in a profession that's dealing with children because you lack the primary skill set to influence them. It's not what you say. It's not spending time playing with them. It is what they are supposed to get from you, from interaction with you, is the ability to manage this system. And that's, if you can't manage your own system, how are you going to help them learn to manage theirs? Neuroscience of Trauma teaches us that the body's responses to being overwhelmed are predictable, absolutely correct biological responses, often tied to the brain and nervous system's desire for safety and protection. So trauma responses generally are going to fall into 4 categories. I don't need to spend a lot of time on them. I just want to make sure you're aware of them. Fight, flight, freeze, and appease. So fighting makes sense. Aggressive, hostile, what you're trying to do is control. Flight, run away, you're still trying to control your risk. Freeze, that has to do with tonic quality of the nervous system. That is also a method. The freeze or feigned death process is the ability to just shut down, disconnect. You begin to anesthetize ourselves. That is also protective. The one that's probably the least understood is the appease. And this is particularly true with more complex traumas. People often wonder, well, why didn't they fight back more? Why didn't they do this? Why didn't they do that? Because when your nervous system is overwhelmed and all you're trying to do is survive, going along with is good sense. It's biologically good sense to go along, even though you're finding the whole thing horrible. And particularly in a vulnerable child that doesn't have a great deal of resources, you often will see them try to appease the person that is putting them in jeopardy. And that's problematic on so many levels. So here's a deeper description. I included this in, these slides were layered before, so you wouldn't have noticed these underneath, but I tried to unlayer them so you could kind of see what I was talking about. So what should you see? What is biologically correct behavior look like? Now, for some of you, this is going to make you really uncomfortable. So pause for a second and just say, look, Bob's talking about a biological process that generates these things. If it's a biological process, is it bad behavior? Is it mental illness? Or should it trigger a response in us that says, what can we do to change the environment? Because these are the things you should see if you have particularly children that are above their threshold of tolerance. If they're above their ability to cope with what's going on in their own system, these are correct behaviors. This first grouping is what we would see as the changes in behavior, emotions, and thinking. Let me just kind of play with you. Would be this. I'm going to go ahead and put all of these up. You're going to see them have a tendency to be all about right now. They're going to have real difficulty looking ahead, planning ahead, thinking future orientation. They're going to be impulsive. They're going to be irrational and illogical. They're going to be very poor self-reflectors and do very little self-evaluation. And they're not going to evaluate rewards well. Well, what a lot of people have been taught because of their history in education or in the mental health field is that these are bad behaviors. But they are not. They are automatic behaviors that are congruent with the biology of what's going on inside our system. If our body is producing hormones and neurochemicals that make these correct, then how can they be wrong? Is there a consequence of these in our lives? Absolutely. But the consequence is not related to the biology. The consequence is usually an environmental reaction to what they're doing. And again, it's going to require adults in working with children to be able to regulate themselves even when this is going on. So let's look at this a little bit. We will experience this change in thinking, emoting, and behaving, whether we're moving into the arousal system for fear or danger or threat, or we move into the arousal system for pleasure, for excitement. We're playing a game. Both of these are going to end us in the same system, and the same mental architecture will take over because it's biologically correct. So let's look at some of this. Oops. So let's say you're behind the wheel of a go-kart. You are driving down the lane. You're trying to beat the other folks at your 12 mile an hour, top end speed. You may bump into somebody else, but would this be a good time for someone to pull up next to you and want to talk about retirement planning or tax shelters? Obviously not. You're not in the right frame of mind to have that discussion. You're all focused in the moment. You're not really being logical. You're having fun. Another example. You're watching a soccer game. You really are a fan of your team. Do you want your goalie on your team during the course of the game to become self-reflective and self-evaluative? In other words, do you want your goalie, instead of paying attention to the game, standing there going, I wonder if I'm a good person? Am I making good life choices? Is this my highest and best use? Most of you would probably want that goalie off the field right now. because the nature of the game requires us to be in that excitatory system. And that is not the system where we do self-reflection and self-evaluation. That's an executive functioning. We're not in executive functioning when we're playing a game. We are having fun, or we're in a competition. We're in a state of arousal. What we also see is that when people are in these states, they make some really poor choices. For example, these young gals had been jumping off the roof into the pool for a while, and this time she missed, and she ended up in a wheelchair with 2 broken feet. Well, once you're broken, you go, gosh, that wasn't a very smart idea, but nobody thought it wasn't a smart idea when they first thought of it, because the moment they moved into arousal, their self-reflection and self-evaluative responses dropped away. That does not make them a willful, inattentive, bad kid. What it does is tell you that they had a biological reaction, and yes, they were hurt, and that's unfortunate, and maybe they will learn a little better. But most of the time, if people are in a dysregulated state, whether it's due to threat or fun, they're not going to be self-reflective and self-evaluating. It isn't the time for it. It isn't the system that's being enlivened right now. And then, of course, there's always those wonderful disagreements we have with loved ones, where we have, of course, being a responsible adult, we have thought it out well. We have looked at both sides of it fairly. We have owned completely our own part of the problem. Then we have calmly sat down to discuss it, and we have thought about what it's going to be, how this is going to affect us in a year or 5 years down the road relationally. Isn't that the way you do these things? Or do you just have a blow up at somebody, and all you want at the moment is to have your own damn way right now, which is incredibly irrational, and it's being driven by physiology, not willful behavior. Very few people get up every morning and think about, gosh, today is my opportunity to be a real ass. Instead, they get up and they're not regulating themselves, and now they go through their whole day reacting to everything. So healthy change requires us to be in Bruce Banner mode, not Hulk mode. This is incredibly important for the teacher to be in Bruce Banner mode. And the teacher, because they're in Bruce Banner mode, has creative strategies to create an environment that encourages more Bruce Banner rather than provoking the Hulk, because learning doesn't occur very well in the Hulk mode. So this is the metaphor I frequently use for this. When you're thinking about the body systems which are in charge, you can pretty much look at somebody and tell if they're in Bruce Banner mode or if they're in Hulk mode. Certainly you can feel the energy around them. And what the real skill of working with human beings is being able to help them, first of all, helping yourself to be able to stay in Bruce Banner mode. And then the next is to help them get in and stay in Bruce Banner mode as well. If you don't like the Bruce Banner and Hulk metaphor, you can use Einstein or Frankenstein as a metaphor, or you can use whatever other metaphor works for you. So how well do you solve problems, learn, develop good habits, and be rational when you are in your dragon mode? This is really for you as the adult, not the child you're working with. How well do you solve problems? How well do you learn? How well do you as an adult develop intentional good habits? How do you as an adult be rational when you are experiencing arousal or overwhelm yourself? That really does take some skills, and it requires practice. Those skills and practice are outside of the scope of this little training, but they are certainly important to kind of learn about. Another way to explain what's going on is what we call the ladder of dysregulation, which kind of grew out of some material by Deb Dana and Stephen Porges, which let me recommend either or both of those folks to you for some reading. At the top of the ladder, which is Bruce Banner or Einstein mode, we have the ventral vagal system. When it's functioning well, most of those hormones are in balance. You're going to want to form social attachments. You're going to want social connections. You're going to be, using logic and reason, and you're going to be able to attune to other people, be a more emotionally available, more empathic in general. You're going to be able to do these things. You'll be assertive without being hurtful, be self-reflective and genuine, develop and maintain good relationships over time, have improved mood and immune function, and be more resilient. So very few people spend much of their day at the top of the ladder, but that's where we want to encourage everybody to kind of migrate to. The middle of the ladder, which is that sympathetic nervous system kicking in, which is to help us get ready for action. What you're going to see when it's alive and well are behaviors like this: aggression, anger, controlling behaviors, sarcasm, threats and name-calling, the use of intimidation to gain control, a desire to run away or flee. Those are pretty common in the middle ground of the ladder. At the bottom of the ladder, we have the dorsal system, which is about conserving energy. It's what we would consider a passive system. It anesthetizes, turns down everything, disconnects us so that we can get through a difficult moment. What you see here is people numb out, shut down, hide out, feel small, not want to participate, hold back, not feel like what they have to say is worthwhile, difficulty sharing any kind of feelings or thoughts or opinions that they have. And that's the bottom of the ladder. So those are three different ways to kind of explain it: the ladder of dysregulation, the Einstein, Frankenstein motif, or the Bruce Banner and Hulk motif. Any of those that work for you, feel free. If you have others that really work for you, also email me and let me know so that I can add them to the retinue that I share with people. So when you're in the middle or bottom of the ladder, how do you personally think, emote, or act? How willing would you be to give up control to someone else, even an authority figure? This is really important. If I am in the sympathetic dominance and I'm looking to control my environment and I'm aggressive and I'm hostile, is this a good time to have an authority figure try to exercise control, be punitive or aggressive with me? What do you think? You realize what I've just said? So let me run past it again. I'm coming in to the environment. I am already aroused, which means I'm already in my sympathetic nervous system. I am already in my Hulk mode or the dragon mode or Frankenstein mode. You see me, you have two choices. One is, how can we create an environment where we can calm that down? Or you can do what a lot of teachers do. You can point it out, shame me, be aggressive with me, be punitive with me, and watch my dragon explode. Watch my Hulk go crazy. But we don't train teachers on how to regulate a classroom full of dysregulated children. And to be honest, when we've done this kind of work with schools, the toughest isn't the management of children. It's the adults managing themselves. And kind of a resentment that they have as educators, that the focus is put on them rather than on fixing kids. Because what we have found over and over again, if the adult in the environment is well regulated and able to stay well regulated even in stressful moments, the kids have a lot fewer behavior problems. The kids have a lot fewer academic problems. The kids tend to be more successful in that class or in that school environment. So the real question is, how well would you surrender control when you feel overwhelmed to somebody else, even an authority figure? And I would imagine you don't do it well. But we expect children to do it well. We expect children to do it because we have the power to force them to do it. And so, of course, because I am the powerful person in that environment, I'm the adult, they have to do what I say because I'm the power and they don't have any. Well, that's a horrible message that we send to children all the time. And it reflects not the nature of being a human being, but the nature of being a dysregulated adult in an environment. How likely would you to believe other people's needs or wants or demands were fair or just when you're in the middle or lower parts of the ladder? When you're in a full-blown arousal, how fair do you think their demands are? Most people would respond to that they don't think they are. How difficult has it been for you to behave rationally with logic and reason when you're in the lower or middle part of your ladder? And how much patience can you exercise when you are in the middle or lower part of the ladder? So these are all the self-reflective questions that go to adults. If you want to manage an environment with children well, you must have an adult that manages themselves well. And that is absolutely essential. There's no walk around for that. So why do we need people to be in their Bruce Banner brain or at the top of the ladder or in their Einstein mode? Because the only time we have access, total access to the following functions is when we're in Bruce Banner mode. When our genius is available, then we can do these things. And as the hormonal level changes, as the neurochemicals shift, and adrenaline, noradrenaline, and cortisol increase, we lose these functions. Not because we've chosen to lose them, not because we're willful, mentally ill people, but because biologically these functions are not possible on a consistent basis if people are in that aroused state. So, we need to be in Bruce Banner mode or Einstein mode to regulate ourselves, to be compassionate with ourselves, to have self-awareness, to be able to use a moral valuing system. Religious or otherwise, it doesn't matter to me, but a well-regulated person can have a sense of morals or values and live by them. But when we become dysregulated, we don't. We're reactive. We're not intentional. And so then we're engaging in behavior and trying to explain it after the fact. Be in self-control. To be able to plan, to problem solve, to do reality checking, to inhibit or stop one's self from doing something. In other words, to change a habit requires some grit. You have to be able to inhibit on a repeated basis. You can only do that if you're pretty well regulated. To grow intentionally, to have resilience, because even when negative things are experienced, you want someone to not be overwhelmed by that. That's really kind of that move towards resilience. So all of these things are necessary for us to live an optimal life. All of these things require us to be at the top of the ladder, or in our Bruce Banner brain. Almost everything that would lead to successful outcomes in an educational setting would be an environment that operates on to promote these, because these are skills that require upper brain function, executive functioning, and they are not available when we are in the middle or lower parts of the ladder, or when we're in our Frankenstein or Hulk portions of our brain. So the question then becomes, how is trauma created? And I'm going to do a really quick overview of this for you, which should kind of help make some sense of this. So we're going to look at what your range of tolerance is. The range of tolerance is how much stress can you tolerate before you're overwhelmed. And as long as you stay within that range, you're pretty resilient. The thing is that what affects that range of tolerance most is the state of the health of the body at the time. The state of health of the body at the time. We all recognize when we don't feel good, we have a cold or allergies, we're not quite as patient, we're not quite as tolerant. We get overwhelmed more easily. Why? Because when our body isn't feeling well, the range of tolerance decreases. And now it's a narrower, more narrow range for us to live in. So it affects our ability to be resilient. So as we are experiencing stress in a daily life, what happens not only is our physiology at work, kind of determining based on the health of the body, but we're also reacting to the environment with changes in our body and the brain and the nervous system. And these also affect the range of tolerance. And as our range of tolerance reduces, so does our resiliency. If we live in environments that are constantly dumping the fiery cocktail into our system, we've gone through 4 health-promoting hormones and neurochemicals. We've gone through 3 that affect that pretty strongly. There's about 35 or so there's a lot of them that I haven't talked about, but I'm going to lump them all into one label called the fiery cocktail. When we get a dose of the fiery cocktail, we're getting doses of these neurochemicals and hormones to push us out, and that what it does is push us outside of our range of tolerance. Unless we are incredibly intentional about the way we live and we're constantly, aware of our body and calming that body down, when you have dose after dose after dose, you're going to get pushed outside your range of tolerance. Now, when we get pushed outside of the range of tolerance, we can be pushed above the range of tolerance, or we can be pushed below the range of tolerance. When we're pushed above the range of tolerance, we engage in what's called a reactive adaption. When we are pushed below the range of tolerance, we enter what would be considered a reactive mitigation. And I'll explain what those are in just a second, but they're very different. When you're looking at the primary theme in the reactive adaptation is to control as much of the environment as I can to feel safe. So you see these people that are aggressive, angry, hostile, assertive, using intimidation. What they're trying to do is gain control in the environment. If that's the goal of their reactive behavior, and they're in a room full, if you're in a room full of kids, several of them are in the reactive adaptation stage, and you try to deal with them by confronting and exercising control over them, what you're going to do is blow them up and make them even more reactive than they were before. On the underside, the primary theme is to avoid threat, the sensations related to threat, and create psychological distancing to feel safe. In other words, this one is trying to control as well, but instead of trying to control the environment, what they're trying to do is control their own experience of what their sensations are. If you use highly aggressive, highly punitive, controlling techniques on this, on the person that mitigates, you're going to totally shut them down, disconnect them, or dissociate them. So if you look at this and you look at the typical classroom management skills that most kids, most of the students that are taught in classroom management techniques, most of those techniques are shame-based, punitive, and aggressive. And that's not going to work with either group that's outside of self-regulation, when they're outside of their window of tolerance. And what we don't do a very good job is teaching teachers, parents, foster parents, adoptive parents, how to parent differently when you cannot use shame, aggression, punitive, or highly assertive approaches to child management. Because none of those will work for the child that's above or below the range of tolerance. So what happens? When we move into a state of arousal, the way we think changes because the way the neurochemicals are being used in our system. So when everything is working well, and both of the entire brain is working as a unity, as an integrated system is a unified system, we call that lateral thinking. In other words, both hemispheres are working back and forth. It has this unity, like a concert to it, and it's wonderful. But when stress occurs or threat appears, or we're engaging in an activity that puts us in a state of arousal, what ends up happening is the divergent and convergent brain more or less separate, and they're no longer doing lateral thinking. The logic center, the planning, the follow through, the executive system, if you will, has been taken out, and the more imaginary system is left going. So we call that logic using system the convergent thinking, and that imaginative thinking as the divergent thinking. But what happens with kids that have trauma histories, or adults that have trauma histories, is that they don't spend a whole lot of time in lateral thinking. And the logic system underserves them quite often. And so what we find is high use of the divergent system. And they have this frenetic activity in that system, which, they're imagining all sorts of scenarios and reacting to those scenarios as if they're real. That's kind of it just continues to dysregulate them more. A well-regulated person, one that is in the range of tolerance, is engaging in lateral thinking. And what we see in people that have trauma histories quite often is divergent-centered thinking. And that's really problematic for a lot of educational purposes. So a traumatized divergent thinking system gets trapped in loops of negative, self-protective, and defensive imaginings. It tends to be self-protective and defensive imaginings tend to expand and increase in painful and distressing intensity. In other words, my lateral system disconnects and I'm now only in my divergent system, and I have a little bit of fear about getting up in front of a group of people talking. And the longer that I stay dysregulated, the more imagining I am doing about failing in this situation. And the more I imagine failing in this situation, the more dysregulated I become, which means I'm now having more and more negative loops of self-protective, and I may totally shut down and not be able to speak at all in front of this group. And that's the nature of the divergent system. Focusing on the body, sensation, and sensory integration, as well as body calming techniques, are needed before other therapeutic interventions. In other words, if you can't get somebody into the range of tolerance, if you can't get them to a place where they can do lateral thinking, then almost all of your interventions are going to be pointless. And we see it over and over again. And what we end up doing is blaming the child or the victim for not being able to do what we are suggesting. But we're suggesting things that we haven't activated the system to support yet. So as changes in the body, brain, and nervous system affect the range of tolerance, you are losing some capacity. The capacity you're losing is generally reduced hippocampal activity, reduced executive functioning, reduced sequential memory, reduced reality checking, reduced impulse control, reduced focus, reduced sleep, and you're really going to see behaviors that may be socially inappropriate, maybe even sometimes illegal, but you're going to see that people have problems solving that. You're going to see that they're going to have difficulty following through on or attaining goals. You're going to see increases in emotional memory, increases in sensory memory, and increases in fear, depression, agitation, and anxiety. So when you move out of the window of tolerance, these are the things you should see. These are not mental illness. These are not bad behavior. They're not willful, intentional behavior. They are the correct responses to the biology of the body and nervous system. That is an incredibly important thing to get a handle on. So when the nervous system is out of balance, what you're going to see, because it's biologically correct and predictable, are a number of things. I don't know that we need to run through this whole list, but you're going to see a lot of rigid black and white thinking. You're going to see a lot of strong belief systems that are not based on real thorough examination of concepts, but more a belief system that is based on just repetitive experience. You're going to see a lot of really negative internal dialogues. You're going to see overly negative memories, and the list goes on. A lot of the times what we have seen in the past is teachers, foster parents, even folks in like juvenile probation programs see these behaviors as evidence of a bad kid or a bad behavior. They see it as evidence that there's something wrong with the kid. And I want to really stress that these are biologically correct responses to a child being in a variety of environments. The question is, who's in charge of those environments, and what are they doing to make those environments environments that would provoke activity in the executive functioning system? What are they doing to provoke Bruce Banner brains being in the room? Because what we find is most systems provoke instead dysregulation. So let me ask you this. If your nervous system is out of balance, you yourself, if your nervous system is out of balance, how effective are you going to be at doing any of the things that we need to do as an adult? How are you going to be an effective or efficient parent? Or how are you going to learn in an optimal way or communicate optimally? Or how are you going to function in a workplace? And that really becomes kind of the core. When we go in and work with schools around trauma-informed care, we really don't work with the kids at all. What we do is work at stabilizing the staff and faculty there and creating environment, helping them create an environment that is intentional, that will help them stay regulated, that will help their kids stay regulated. And that's kind of a novel idea, because what we find really common in almost all systems that work with children is that you have dysregulating adults expecting the child to be more regulated than they are. And that is an incredible burden to put on the shoulders of a child. A child, if they regulate very well, it's because they come out of an environment where regulating pretty well is how the adults in their world work. And if the unfairness of expecting a child to outperform the adults in their life or to outperform the environment that they're in is really problematic. As an adult, if I walk into an environment where the sound is too loud, I always have the choice of withdrawing, because the sound in the environment is overwhelming to me, so I can withdraw. But kids in classrooms don't have that permission. If the environment is overwhelming, they just can't get up and walk out. If you're looking at this in foster care or an adoptive family, if kids just don't have the freedom to respond to the environment the way that an adult does. And so what happens is, when they do act out, which is biologically correct to do so, everybody around them will deal with it. The people that deal with it effectively are the adults that keep themselves well regulated. The people that will see it as a power struggle, or they'll get upset at the child, are not regulating themselves well enough. And we see this rampant in education. We see it rampant in parenting. The most popular form of parenting in the United States, at least, is the parenting by annoyance. In other words, the rules are always in flux based on the mood of the parent, and that there are very few real rules in these homes that are based on, some kind of concrete, very clear, very certain process. Instead, what we're training kids to do is to be hypervigilant, and that what's most important, particularly in an environment with a dysregulated adult, is to pay attention to what the adult's doing. If the adult is upset, is this making the adult unhappy? Is this making the adult mad? And trying to do things to appease the adult, rather than, because they don't have any choice of leaving the environment. And this is one of the ways we significantly strip self-worth away from children and teach them that that they shouldn't pay attention to what's going on in their own body because they're in a situation they can't escape. Living with a dysregulated, poorly organized parent is a source of trauma. How long will these hormones and biochemicals be out of balance? That's a good question. And it has a lot to do with the state of the history of the person. And remember that our biology learns to operate by what's usually going on in our body. And so if we want to look at this a little bit differently, let's do it this way. If you grew up in and are currently living in a well-regulated, relatively optimal environment, you're going to be pretty quick at metabolizing the neurochemicals and hormones that are built into the arousal system. You should be able to function pretty well in 15 to 30 minutes. However, your body is still in a state of arousal until all of those chemicals are metabolized. Now, if you have an optimal life, your body should be able to metabolize that stuff in somewhere near 6 hours. If you have a history of being in a state of arousal, again, you may be able to function pretty well in 20 to 30 minutes, but the likelihood is that your body's still in a state of arousal until all of that is metabolized. That could be up to 30 hours. What's the difference? The more optimal our history and current living environments are, the more quickly our body metabolizes that process. They metabolize the neurochemicals. The less optimal our life experience is, either historically or currently, the slower this is going to be. Why should this body work really hard to get back into baseline when the next dose of the fiery cocktail is going to come in a few minutes? And so a lot of this has to do with the sensitivity of the developmental history of the person. However, when we're dealing with children, one of the things that's absolutely necessary to understand is that this charge up of their system is going to take a while. And it's not like you can say, sit down and sit still, and their whole body just shifted. So the short end for the people that have more optimal backgrounds and current living situations is roughly 6 hours. Remember, you're going to function really well in 15 to 20 minutes, 30 minutes. But your body's still in a state of stress due to the arousal for roughly 6 hours. And the more trauma history you have, in other words, that history of trauma, toxic stress, and adversity that you have, will lengthen out the time it takes for your body to get back into a well-regulated state, back into the range of tolerance. So we call this being biologically kindled, or neurobiologically being kindled, meaning that you have a standing amount of this stuff in your system. You don't need a great big dose. A little tiny dose will push you over. Let me give you an example. You've had a pretty relaxed day, you've just been accomplishing things that you wanted to, you've been pretty laid back. One of your kids does something. It's not the greatest thing, but it's not earth-shattering either, and you kind of laugh it off and go on about your way. 3 weeks go by. This week, you have had a crazy week, a lot of stressors, a lot of pressures added to you, a lot of demands that you weren't expecting, and now the child does the same exact thing. And this time, the parent blows up at them screams at them like it's, a world-ending situation. And the nature of the thing hasn't changed at all. But what has changed is the degree to which the parent is regulated. And we see this over and over and over again. And this is one of the challenges of parenting by annoyance, is that you're constantly forcing a child to be paying more attention to the mood state of the adult than the rules, which teaches us that rules don't matter. Not upsetting somebody that's in power over you is the thing you're supposed to pay attention to. And that's a horrible pressure to put on kids. So the environments we know that are the most destructive for, or the most creating of complex trauma, is early developmental environments that are chaotic, aggressive, punitive, inconsistent, where the environment is unstable. It could be unstable relationally, it can be unstable economically, residentially. There's lots of ways to be unstable. Where substance use doesn't require addiction, just where substances are abused, and where there's high stress. If this looks kind of like the recipe for the home you grew up in, you may want to look at what kind of home are you creating. And this is kind of an important aspect. I think when we look at foster care settings or adoptive parents or educational settings, you can see that a lot of efficiency-driven systems tend to be chaotic, aggressive, punitive, and inconsistent, because and that's really tough if you have dysregulated children. They don't prosper in these environments. In fact, they end up having all sorts of problems related to this. The first time we really were aware on a big numerically statistical way that this was a problem, and in fact, the first time we really identified what we call a social determinant of health, was pioneered by Dr. Vincent Folletti and Dr. Robert Andis of the CDC at the time. What they did is they took a number of folks. They were looking for 26,000 participants, but what they ended up with was 17,421 participants. And what they found was stunning, that that if you had one of 10 elements, and the more of them you had, the more likely you were going to have health issues throughout your life. And the 10 things that they looked at were substance abuse, parental separation, divorce, mental illness, domestic violence in the family, criminal behavior, and then you look at the abuse factors: psychological, physical, and sexual abuse, or emotional and physical neglect. So half of the list is household dysfunction, half of the list is abuse. Almost everybody looks at the abuse neglect, says, yep, that's the problem. That's where we need to focus. And folks, that's great, but half of the problem in these numbers is household dysfunction. Complex trauma is usually a household dysfunction situation. Now, if you complicate it with abuse, that just makes it worse. But you don't need to have any abuse or neglect to generate trauma symptoms in a home that's truly dysfunctional. Dysfunctional is what any home will be where the adults are not well regulated in that environment, Where the adults don't manage themselves well, you cannot expect a child to regulate themselves well. It just doesn't make any sense. But we continue to think that way in almost all systemic settings where we're dealing with children. So the difference in having one or 10 of these was really interesting. In the original research, I'm going to look at the people that had 0 first. If you had 0 of the 10 items that we just went through, let's just look at suicide. 1 in 96 people will attempt suicide. With a score of 7, 1 in 5 will attempt suicide. So the risk to the individual, the degree of dysregulation that is present as the number of traumas go up is a pretty amazing predictor of lifelong health. Folks, this is not the mythology that we have kind of grown up with. The children are resilient. If we just get them in a new environment, everything will be wonderful. Well, if we get them in a new environment, one that is well-regulated, one that is populated by well-regulated adults, yes, it can help. But the reality is that we often don't prepare teachers, we don't prepare foster parents adequately to know how to conceptualize what they're dealing with. And they're very difficult issues to deal with, because to deal with it effectively requires the adult, first and foremost, to be able to regulate themselves. And we don't live in a society that promotes self-regulation for adults. In fact, our society promotes dysregulation, because if we didn't, people wouldn't buy all the crap that we want them to buy if they really were rational, clear-headed, and not making emotional purchases. No one in government wants a well-regulated society, because then most of the people that are in power would be booted out. And we see this. We don't like dealing with the consequences of dysregulation in society, but our society is designed to keep people dysregulated. And so it's kind of one of those, and you have to change the systems that work. School systems need to change, court systems need to change, communities need to change, where you have adults in all settings that are regulating themselves pretty well, to give children a chance to learn how to regulate themselves and be productive. The higher one's ACE score, the more likely they are to experience these adaptions in the following ways. They're going to see the world through a unique perceptual lens. They're going to make neurobiologically correct behavior. They're going to have high levels of emotionality. They're going to have some cognitive challenges. They're going to often have too much muscle tension, where they actually end up creating additional inflammation and pain in the body. Their physiology may be affected even at a cellular level. And in potentiated reactivity, they're going to move the patterns that they use, get habituated, and they use them quickly and fast. And finally, it can impact them genetically. So stress in this body is not something that we should just ignore. And we should do things to create environments that are stressful enough to provoke growth, but not stressful enough to provoke overwhelm of our range of tolerance. So what is happening physiologically? We're having reactive adaptions or mitigations. These are not weighed, they're not evaluated, they've become automatic and reactionary responses. The adaptions are impacting the entirety of the body and brain, and the child or children are not designed to be independent of the adults in their life. They thrive or not thrive based on the quality and quantity of connectedness they have with a well-regulated adult in a well-regulated environment. In any system that is dealing with children, we need to really look at how that system is organized and how it functions. And what are we doing as a society to encourage the people in that environment to be able to regulate themselves? The cost of not doing so is incredibly high. So when the sympathetic system is dominant, what are you going to notice? In other words, when I'm in that middle of the ladder field of operation, what you're going to see is that I'm going to have more difficulty identifying and verbalizing emotion. I'm going to have difficulty modulating or moderating my emotion. You're going to notice that it's difficult to create distinctions in experience. I'm going to have trouble discerning the difference between being angry and just being frustrated. I'm not going to make distinctions very well. It's difficult to express resilience. It's difficult to enact coping strategies when you're in that middle sympathetic dominant state. You're going to have difficulty recognizing social cues. Social cues require self-regulation, self-reflection, and self-evaluation. Well, if you're not a well-regulating person, you're not going to pay that much attention to social cues unless they're tied to threat. So you will pick up on the social cues of an untrusted adult because that's survival-oriented. But in normal circumstances where survival isn't on the table, they're not going to notice social cues nearly as much. And they're not going to respond appropriately often to social situations. What you're going to see is an increase in explosive emotional volatility. You're going to see a lot of unmodulated emotional expressions. You're going to see a lot of relational difficulties. Are the behaviors that we have talked about unpleasant, annoying? Do they disrupt situations? Yes, they do. Absolutely. But they are not wrong, they are not bad, and they're not inappropriate. They're exactly the right biological response. And punishing and shaming and being aggressive with somebody is not the answer. Let me say it again. Shaming, we have been doing research on shame for over 50 years, and there isn't a single study that says shame is an effective strategy for behavior change. But it is so popular to use. It's used most often by adults that cannot regulate themselves well. So they shame, they blame, they are aggressive, and they're punitive. If you have those qualities, you do not belong in any environment that is managing children. If you're a parent with those attributes, you really need to work on growing yourself a bit, because this is going to create another generation of highly dysregulated children. So what do you notice? How often are you reacting rather than being intentional in your own personal life? This is one of those questions I like people to kind of pause and think about. Are you intentional? Are you deliberate? The reality for most of us is that about 90% of our day we're just running on habit. And a lot of what we do is just based on habit, not being mindful. You can't be totally aware of everything. That's beyond our capacity as human beings. But there's middle ground there. We need to be more intentional, more planful, and more self-regulating. How is your decision making when you are in an imbalanced state? When you're in middle or bottom of the ladder, for example, how's your decision making? Your personal decision making. Now, the problem with this is that everybody wants to believe that the problem is not them, it's out there somewhere. This isn't just in the situation of a teacher or a parent or a foster parent or an adoptive parent. This is just human beings in general. When we become dysregulated, we don't want responsibility for ourselves. Somebody pulls out of traffic and cuts us off, and which makes us afraid. We become angry because we're feeling afraid. And then what do is we say, that asshole, look what that person did. The reality is that we've all cut people off in traffic if we drive at all. And we rarely are doing it maliciously. But at that moment, when you are dysregulated, then the natural human thing is to attack something out here. Because as long as we're attacking out here, we don't have to fix this. This is what needs to change if you're going to work with children. And that's a really hard lesson for folks. This has to change if you're going to work with children. Not that out there. Because before you can affect that out there, this needs to be well regulated and creating the environment and the relationships that allow to create that environment that is more balanced. This is going to require us to let go of unhelpful belief systems that we have and biases that protect our ego, rather than admitting that we suck as an adult responsible for a child's environment. We tend to want to blame the child for that. And that's really problematic because children's emotional state is usually what we call state dependent, based on what's going on in their own body. The same with us. If we are not able to manage our emotional state, what kind of environment are our children walking into? And that's something that is really difficult for people to get a handle on. So what we focus on when we're working with people is really to help them, number one, be able to self-regulate themselves. And if we're working in a setting with children, whatever adults are involved, whatever adults are in that child's life, we are not working on the child learning to regulate themselves. We're working with the adults in that child's life to help them regulate better, because children will learn and learn to self-regulate better by emulating an adult that they have a relationship with than they will through any kind of instruction you give them. Self-regulation is primarily learned by children through a social interaction with a safe adult, not through lessons in classrooms. Capacity building, how do we build their capacity? How do we help them meet their primary social and emotional needs? How do we increase their ability to have autonomy and make choices? How do we develop a long-term view of positive expectation? How do we strengthen their interpersonal resources? And how do we strengthen their personal resilience to stressors? The answer to all of these things that we need to focus on for wellness in the child have to be part of the character, practice, and and environment that an adult in that child's life is creating. In other words, we need adults to grow up and be mature adults and make decisions based on what they want to create in the environment that they live in, rather than being reactive to their child. Whether that's their biological child or a foster child or any system that's dealing with children. The adults in that system must be able to regulate, focus on building capacity, have their own primary social and emotional needs met, that they have enough capacity to be autonomous, to make choices from a variety of choice options, that they have a long-term view of getting through things, and that they are constantly strengthening their own personal resources and also strengthening their resilience to stressors. So for kids to get these lessons and learn them well, require being in the presence of an engaged, attending, relational adult that is doing these in their own life. Otherwise, they're going to do the normal above or below behaviors that are associated with being outside the range of tolerance. So when the limbic system shifts, there are predictable results. These are not bad behavior. There may be social consequences, but these are not bad behavior. They are predictable, biologically correct responses. So the person that is above the threshold in reactive adaptions, they're very overt, they're very action-oriented, they're going to be angry and inattentive, and they're going to be fidgety and aggressive and defensive and reactive and hyperactive and have a lot of anxiety, be very impulsive and hostile. They're going to be irrational. They're not going to use logic well. They're going to be irritable. They're often self-centered, and they are going to have difficulty reaching the normal developmental milestones that we think of in child development. So if this is the pattern of behavior you're seeing in children, the chances are pretty good that what you are going to see in the environment that they live in are behaviors like this, where there's a lot of labeling. Men are this, women are that. There's a lot of global labeling in that environment. There's a lot of criticism in that environment. There's a lot of blaming in that environment. There's a lot of abrupt limit setting based on the annoyance factor of the adult rather than the rules. There's a lot of threatening going on. There's a lot of ultimatums being given. There's a lot of mind reading where other family members assume they know what you're thinking and what it means. A lot of hurtful, innocent observations, and a lot of humiliating statements, and a lot of shame statements, and a lot of dismissing comments. So the person that's living in this environment is going to be somewhat aggressive to try to get control in an environment that makes them feel less than in control. And these are pretty consistent patterns. This isn't all of it you would see, but they're certainly common ones. Now, what about below the threshold behaviors, the mitigating behaviors, the ones that are really the covert behaviors? This is where you see dissociation and numbing. This is where you'll see withdrawal and sadness and self-centeredness, but it's a different kind of self-centeredness. There it is more of, I'm not worthy, I'm not lovable, I'm not, kind of self-centered things. They're going to find a lot of distraction and self-soothing behaviors, a lot of addiction, a lot of self-injury and suicidality, and a lot of compulsive behaviors. Because what you're trying to do with the mitigating behavior is to create space to not experience something that you don't want to experience, rather than creating, a space where people would be in better touch with that stuff. So these are the behaviors that you will see that are very common to covert environments. A lot of whining. In the adult, that would be a lot of nagging, shrugging shoulders, moving away or turning away or looking away when someone's talking to you. A lot of emotional flatness, a lot of appearing disinterested, a lot of mocking, contemptuous tones. Don't seem to have any real interest in things. Fatigued, listless, needed immense amounts of reassurance for relatively simple things. A good example of this for me was being in a grocery store a number of years ago, and the parent told their two children that they could have something on this kind of wall of candy. It must have been 70 different candies, there. And the kids, not only could they had difficulty making up their mind what they wanted, but they kept checking with other folks, their mother and other people in line, about whether this was a good choice or not. And so much so that the mother got through her whole grocery order, and she's trying to get it paid for, but they haven't made a decision. In frustration, she finally just decides for them, and off they go. And the kids were complaining because they couldn't make a decision. They were having trouble making a decision, and they needed a lot of reassurance. That's not abnormal in this kind of an environment. So why do we see these biologically correct behaviors emerge? Why do they become habituated or automatic behaviors? It has a lot to do with the way the brain is built. The brain is built, first and foremost, to be safe, to guarantee our survival. And the next part of our brain that kicks in is the avoidance of pain. We don't want to feel pain or discomfort, and pain can be any form of pain: psychological, emotional, social, relational, you name it. We want to avoid all sorts of pain. The conservation of energy piece is really important, and then we have the pleasure and gain portion. So as long as people are in a state of arousal, they're in the safety or avoidance of pain mechanism, and the more survival oriented a behavior is, the more likely we're going to make it a habit. And that's that conservation of energy. It takes a lot of energy to be intentional, to grow deliberately, to learn deliberately. And if you're not in a relaxed body, if you're not feeling well within your range of tolerance, then you rarely are going to ever go into those higher brain functions. Not because you're a bad person, not because you're a willful person, but because your whole nervous system is built, and the habits through conservation of energy have been built to be protective rather than learning oriented. This is often problematic for people that are looking for ways to make sense of what they're seeing with kids, because these kids engage in what would be considered kind of almost automatic response. And they should, because part of the way the brain and nervous system is built, you build a habit really quickly of something that's survival oriented. And the way our brain and nervous system are built is to overlearn the negative, painful experiences, underlearn the positive. Because the negative, painful experiences generally have to do with survival. Almost everybody can remember, if I were to ask you a question as an adult, what's the most, who's the person that significantly betrayed you in your life? You almost instantly can think of that person, pull up their image in your head, and maybe even have an emotional feeling about that, because that's a survival-oriented kind of response. But how many of you can remember the details of your 8th birthday party, which was probably a positive experience? The way our human nervous system is built is we overlearn the negative and underlearn the positive. So part of managing children is to create a well-managed, positive environment and maintain it as long as possible every day, because it's going to require a lot more time in the positive environment in order to create stability than it would be to create habits in a survival-oriented world. I hope that kind of makes sense. So why are these things so difficult for us? Here's an example. That's a memory that was just made. We'll show it to you again in a minute. But this memory has all these channels of information on it. It has what you were sensing, physically, what you were sensing emotionally, what were the language words that were associated with this, what was the tactile and the olfactory, and was there any taste to it, was there any sound attached to it. And so that's a complete sensory experience plus context in that connection. So let's look again at how this works. This is the same image, but this time it's slowed down. Look at how active those nerve endings are to be able to connect and make a memory. Now, what happens is those that we have repetitively over and over and over again tend to build a neural pathway. A neural pathway looks like that, like right here. These neural pathways are fast, easily accessible, patterned responses. They are the foundation of every belief and attitude you have. What we're really saying is that most of your belief system is built by happenstance by your experiences in an environment, and the nervous system that's built in response to that. Again, this is another reason why we need to really pay attention to environments. Rather than blaming individuals for the problem, which is easy, it lifts the burden of change off of the environment and puts it on the person. And we are desperate in the education world, we're desperate for the problem to be the child, because it would create too much disruption if we had to rebuild this whole system. And of course, it's not the way we do things that's the problem. It's not the fact that we learned child management skills or classroom management skills, and we're in our college programs last year or the year before that were pioneered in the Eisenhower era in the mid-50s, when they weren't dealing much with traumatized children, and we haven't really upgraded the system. What we expect is highly diverse neurological individuals to come into our system and to acquiesce and be compliant, rather than how do we help enliven their interest in learning? How do we help them stay regulated so they want to learn? How do we help encourage that? And, is the environment that we have need to be improved in some way? The responsibility of every institution I see out there wants the burden of the problem to be on the shoulders of children rather than on the adults where it belongs. The child's the problem. I have these 3 or 4 troublemakers in my class. My child won't do as I say. Or the child that I'm fostering will not do as I say. The problem is not generally the child. The problem is generally the environment and how well regulated the adults in that environment are. Well, that makes people really uncomfortable to hear. But I'm not going to soften it up, because we have had over 100 years of blaming the child for the problem in the classroom, and rather than blaming it on the organization of the room, the number of students in a classroom, the quality of the teacher education that goes on, the structure of the support systems, the nature of the systems of education. We as human beings operate on what's called a neuroceptive level. In other words, we have a cellular awareness of the body and our what's going on around us. And the first patterns that are built in us, in those neural patterns that I was just showing you, those neural pathways, the first ones that are built in our human experience are relational patterns, emotive patterns, cognitive patterns, and how to use your body patterns. And once these patterns are built, we run on them automatically. We don't think about them anymore. We just run on them. And we're not looking for them not to be right or not to work, because they're automatic. We just do them because they're now habit for us. It requires a lot of self-reflection and a self-evaluation, and to be tuned into our own awareness and to be fully present in a situation for us to be different than running on habit. And that's really the invitation to adults that work with children is, look at what are your habits? How are you changing them? How are you growing? How are you keeping yourself regulated? How are you living the life you're trying to encourage children to live? If you are not the poster child of self-regulation in your own personal life, what do you have to offer children that are having difficulty regulating themselves? I'm going to suggest nothing. And you ought to really consider whether being in a field that works with children is for you. We all have experiences. We have facts. These are facts. You were fired from a job. You moved to a new house. You were rude to a waitress. Someone spit at you. You yelled at a coworker. You dropped a coffee. Those are just facts. They mean nothing. They're just facts. When you have experiences over and over again, though, the natural way our brain works is to take these experiences and give them meaning. And the meaning isn't the fact, so I dropped my coffee and spilled it on myself and another patron in this place. That's the fact. The meaning I give it may be totally unrelated to the experience. The meaning I might give it is just, this is more evidence of what a klutz I am, or how ungraceful I am, or how awkward I am. And now the meaning does not equal the experience. And the more negative our environment is, the more negatively we are going to cast these experiences in the way we think, in the way we understand them. So what kind of beliefs will those with toxic stress and trauma, with a trauma learning history develop? These are common beliefs. In other words, these are neural pathways that have been built in the lives of people that have these kinds of experiences. They're going to have a fear of trusting people. Yet they desperately want to trust people. They're going to feel lonely. They're going to feel a lot of self-blame, a lot of self-doubt, a lot of intense shame. They're going to feel hypervigilant. They're going to have a difficulty having faith or hope that something can happen. They're going to have a lot of emotional or memory flashbacks. They're going to have a lot of behavior driven by unmet needs. These are predictable, biologically correct responses from having grown to a maturity, or to, at least through adolescence, in a highly stressed environment. This doesn't even require any abuse at all. Just growing up in a stressed environment is going to generate these in the lives of folks. So to be trauma sensitive or compassionate, and I'm gonna finish up in about 10 minutes, and then I'll answer questions for a few minutes, for those people that are interested in asking some questions. But I want to go through this. If you're going to work from a trauma-sensitive or trauma-informed perspective, there are core features that have to be in place. In other words, if you're a teacher and you're looking at an environment, what needs to be there? If you're a parent or a foster parent looking at what you want to create in this environment, these are the things that must be there in order to help a child be regulated on a regular basis. So let's go through them. There's 8 of them. Safety, physical, emotional, social, psychological, and spiritual safety. The next is certainty, the idea that an outcome is promised if not guaranteed. In other words, if you do this, you will get this. And you have to make sure that you are making those small enough to be doable by the child with the least amount of ability. Clarity, all action, all process, how things are organized, ordered. It has to be explicit, it has to be plain, it has to be understandable. It has to be predictable. Again, that if predictability has to do with, I believe I can get a desired action. There has to be self-regulation in that environment. Action must be personally relevant. Let me give you an example of this one. Kid comes into school, they are really overwhelmed. They've had 3 days they've been with parents. There's a 3-day weekend. They come into the first day of school. They have been in a state of arousal for the last 3 days, constantly having that system jacked up. They walk into class, they shouldn't be able to sit still, they shouldn't be able to focus, they shouldn't be attending very well, they should be fidgety, they should want to be talking to their neighbor, because children that are dysregulating want to make a social connection, usually with a peer. The things that most people see as problem behavior, they're engaging in, and now they get somebody to react to them negatively. That blows them up even more. And here we have a teacher trying to teach a subject, let's say spelling. For the child that's in an aroused state, the fact that you want them to learn something does not make it relevant to them. The fact that you as a teacher are being graded on how well they do is not relevant to them. You have to make it relevant to them. So you want to include words that have an interest for them. And then they can engage in that process. If they're in, if you have a few kids in a classroom that are interested in airplanes, include some airplane-related words in that spelling. If you have somebody that's interested in ballet dancing, throw a ballet word or two in that spelling lesson. But it has to be personally relevant to the individual. So much of what goes on in systems like the educational system, we expect the child to learn something because it's relevant to the system, which totally ignores the last 50 years of neuroscience that we have. If you want somebody that is dysregulated to learn something, it must be relevant to them, not relevant to you for them, not your thought that later on in their life they'll need this so it's relevant. It has to be relevant in the moment to them in order to help them. It requires an attuned, securely attached relationship. An attuned relationship, one where someone can look at us and say, oh, there's something going on with this person, and have some sensitivity to that. In therapy world, we call that a secure or a secure attachment or a therapeutic alliance. And then finally, that you have to focus on what their capacities are, what their competencies are, rather than on what their deficits are. It's real easy for a dysregulated person to focus on deficits. It requires somebody to be able to regulate themselves to focus on what might be the capacity of that person. So these are really kind of important concepts. If you do not have a trauma-informed environment, let me say this again, you do not have a trauma-informed environment unless you are living this criteria. One or two of these does not make a trauma-informed environment. This is an all or nothing kind of thing. If you are going to be a trauma-informed program, you have to include these things because these are the necessary attributes to creating programs and treatment of people with trauma histories. So what I'm encouraging you to do is to understand trauma by recognizing that many of the behaviors and responses are ways of adapting to and coping with traumatic experiences. A lot of what you're seeing isn't bad behavior. A lot of what you're seeing is absolutely correct biological responses that should be occurring because of the state of their body. Instead of fighting the behavior, we need to focus on how can I change the environment, which is a whole different skill set than what most people have been prepared for. We have to promote safety by establishing safe physical, emotional, environmental, meet basic needs as much as possible, all without being reactive, demanding, punitive, or getting into power struggles with dysregulated youth. We have to be relationally focused. Being relational in our society, which doesn't promote relationship, is really tough. Yet we know that people that have trauma histories or traumatic stress learning histories, particularly if they have complex or chronic trauma in their lives, is they need a relationship to help them stabilize. So learning to be relational for everybody you come in contact with is kind of daunting for some folks, but it's necessary. And finally, competency. Focus on competency. This will build responses that are consistent, they're predictable, they're clinically appropriate, they're respectful, and they encourage and empower others. It doesn't make sense that we focus on the problem all the time. One of the things I really appreciate for those of you that are work in the school world or have school world experience, Howard Glasser, who lives in Tucson, developed a program that was originally for parents and teachers to work with kids that were, highly dysregulated kids. And part of that was in his Nurtured Heart program. You're welcome to get the book and read it. In the Nurtured Heart program, what he was suggesting is that we focus on the possibility, focus on the positive, focus on the competency, and we really underscore that, and we minimize our responses to the challenges, the disruptive kid, and really look at what do we need to build a skill set to help us create that environment of empowerment for kids. He didn't label it quite like that, but that's kind of what he was suggesting is, attending to their potential competency, their partial responses that we're encouraging. But that's not what happens. In almost every system, what people do is focus on the disruptions, the behavior that they are finding annoying. And of course, if someone has the audacity to annoy me as an adult, well, then they've got a problem and they need to be fixed. And that's a very narcissistic, we have a lot of information out there in the world today on the web about narcissism. But the most chronic form of narcissism, the most damaging form of narcissism outside of the walls of one's home is in the walls of every system that wants us to set aside normal human functioning, normal human responses, and just be compliant and acquiescent. That is one of the most damaging, disrespectful thought processes we can possibly have. So what makes up resilience? We've talked a lot about, what the attributes are if you're going to be trauma informed. But what we notice that the attributes of resilience look like this. That people that have good resilience are able to regulate their emotions. They are able to control their impulses. They are people that experience empathy, not sympathy. Empathy is different. Empathy, the way a lot of people interpret it is, I'm going to connect with their painful story and really, oh man, they were really hurt. Empathy is not about that. Empathy is about understanding how human beings function and being tolerant for that. They are going to be relatively optimistic. They are going to be able to analyze a cause, not look at a behavior and say the behavior is the problem, but look at what is the environment that's generating this and how can I create a different environment. That's really kind of an important piece to be able to do. They have feelings of being effective, and they have kind of reaching out, expanding. Another way of looking at this, one of Milton Erickson's daughters, when I had a chance to visit with her a number of years ago, said to me that one of the things she really admired about her dad was he lifted everybody that he came in contact with. He intentionally did things to lift them up. That's that constant expanding and reaching out. People that are resilient tend to lift others. So we have gone through the biology and why people are behaving the way they behave. We've talked about what's biologically correct, what's not. We've talked about how the systems of care and our habit and our mythology and child rearing practices and child management practices fall quite a bit short of the science that we've been developing particularly in the last 30 years. And the amount of science that keeps unfolding, suggesting we need to change more rapidly, is, just continuing to flow. And yet where we really need help is advocacy in large systems. When it's painful enough for the large system that they can't continue to do what they've been doing, they will change. But as long as they can get people to be compliant and acquiesce, why should they change? So we'll underserve people, we'll underserve children, because it's easier for us to do it the way we're familiar with than to change everything and have to experiment with how to regulate this group of kids. It's really problematic. So if you are going to work with children, you as the helper must be able to regulate your own threat stress response system. In other words, you must be the living model of self-regulation if you want children that you work with to be able to do that. 2, you have to actively create an environment of felt and real safety, one that's predictable and has a sustainable basis. 3, you model the life you are asking others to live and help them regulate themselves. I don't know how often I hear mental health professionals give advice to clients to do things that they don't do, and then they're surprised that the client fails. Clients will not outregulate their therapist. Kids will not outregulate their parent. This requires the people in the higher up in the organization, the more decision makers there are, the more they have to be living the concepts that we want to influence children with. Always help others regulate themselves with your behaviors, thinking, and emotion. In other words, you're either in the state of helping co-regulate with somebody or you're exciting their system. So work on always being the person that lifts, that encourages them to regulate themselves, that is an example of that. So again, you had this presentation as the result of the work of the Trauma-Informed Primary Prevention Program. There's a lot of, to be honest with you, I can't see the little tiny writing on the monitor with these eyes. So please read through this information and reach out to the people that sponsored this and give them a thanks.